Welcome to the Authentic Cinema Podcast, Episode 3. Today we're going to be talking about Hal Ashby's 1972 film, The Last Details, starring Jack Nicholson, Randy Quaid, and Otis Young. I'm here joined, as always, by my co-host, Bob Lyren. Bob, how are you?
I'm pretty excited to talk about this movie. I think one of the things I was thinking about before we get into the film is that, this is the Authentic Cinema Podcast. And there's a part of this conversation that we're going to have, which is about the era in which this movie was made and, made in 1973. And certainly you and I know, and probably a lot of our listeners that are familiar with, the history of Hollywood know that this movie was made in essentially the most authentic period of American cinema, the 1970s. Absolutely. And I was thinking about it while I was watching this movie. I'm like, if we wanted to, the Authentic Cinema Podcast could literally just be movies from the 1970s. We could literally start in 1969 with Easy Rider and end in 1980 with Heaven's Gate and only talk about movies in the 70s and probably have over 100 episodes.
Yeah, so it's like the cool Easy Riders, Raging Bulls kind of thing,
exactly.
And we could just stay there. We could just
stay in that 11-year period, right?
We could go into that hole.
And every film that we talked about would be one of the most authentic films ever made. So it's cool that we're actually talking about one from this decade.
Well, and I think we're talking about one that is not, for whatever reason, it's not as well known anymore. Although I do remember growing up in Moscow, Idaho, at the video store we used to go to, and there was a poster of Jack Nicholson with the cigar in the video store. And it was always there. It was just always, I just remember it, and that poster image always makes me think of a video store in the late 80s, early 90s. Like it was something, But it is not as well known of a film. This is a film actually that. And also, I should say, the director, Hal Ashby, is, for whatever reason, he was a big player in that kind of 1970s American, let's just call it, for the purposes of this podcast, the American New Wave. Hal Ashby was a big kind of director. He did some important films.
He was on a heater. On a heater in the 70s. He did Harold and Maude in 1971.
That's right.
He did The Last Detail in 73. He did Shampoo in 75. He did Bound for Glory in 76, Coming Home in 78, which is we could do a whole nother podcast on Coming Home versus Deer Hunter, which many people have done podcasts on that. And then he closed out the decade in 1979 with Being There. Yeah. So those six movies, that's that puts you in a pantheon of amazing directors. But like you said, absolutely, he's kind of forgotten.
In my research, I don't think no one's written a book about him. There's very little information, like interviews and things like that. But yeah, it is very interesting. And I think there was a part of me that kind of wanted to bring, in my own very small way, bring Hal Ashby back into the discourse. This is a guy that he was really one of the, he's an important filmmaker. Whatever you think, he's an important filmmaker who made some really important films in the most, what you and I probably believe to be the most important era of American cinema. Certainly the most experimental and kind of radical time. What's also interesting about this film is written by Robert Towne, who would go on to do Chinatown next with Jack Nicholson. They would do that together with Roman Polanski. But I kind of always have thought of this film. This is the last film that Nicholson did before he became Jack Nicholson.
Yeah, dude. This was the jump off.
He's probably the greatest movie star from this era. This is the last film before he became a superstar, is what I'm trying to say.
Right.
After Chinatown, Jack Nicholson was it,
Basically, from 1958 to 1969, Nicholson was in a bunch of B movies, Roger Corman productions. I stopped counting at 15 films. So he made 15 films from 58 to 69. And they have crazy titles, just weird B movies. And then he was in Easy Rider in 69, which is really the jump off for this American new wave cinema. But then here's what he did in a row. He banged out a couple of heaters. So he did Easy Rider in 69. Five Easy Pieces in 1970.
Yeah, great film.
1971, Carnal Knowledge with Art Garfunkel.
Yep.
1973, The Last Detail, which we're talking about today. The next year, 1974, Chinatown with Polanski and Robert Towne, as you mentioned. And then 1975, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest.
Right.
So, like, as you said, like, this dude, like, after The Last Detail, it's just like a jump off, dude. He's gone. Like, never to be touched again. He's now like a satellite, a rocket shot.
He's sitting courtside at the Lakers with his sunglasses on. Okay.
Right, for the rest of his life. Yeah.
Jack was born.
I think that the interesting thing about The Last Detail, and what we're going to get into, is that how much, not only just about the film itself and what the film is, but also how integral Jack Nicholson's performance is to the film. And then we have the luxury of hindsight to kind of like watch his, like, as you said, this was like his first film, so to speak. Like, this dude, after this, we know him. So to watch this film is great. It's awesome because you get to see all these little kernels and little nuggets of like what this guy's going to become after this.
There's one thing, just because we were talking about Robert Towne, a big part of this movie, what makes it so authentic, is the dialogue, actually. It's a beautiful story all the way around. The screenplay, though, I think is really like a masterpiece. It's a masterpiece. And it's full credit to Robert Towne. And I found a quote from Gerald Ayres, I think is how you pronounce his name, who's the producer. After doctoring and appearing in Drive, he said, for debutante director Nicholson, Towne was hired for the project by producer Gerald Ayres, who recalled, he had this ability in every page he wrote and rewrote to leave a sense of moisture on the page, as if he had just breathed on it in some way. There was always something that jostled your sensibilities, that made the reading of the page not just a perception of plot, but the feeling that something accidental and true to life of a human being had happened there. And I thought that's
amazing.
That's a really great quote, and
it's true.
It's so true about this film.
It is so true about this movie.
One side note, real quick. Sorry, Drive. He said. You know who else was in Drive? He said, with Nicholson. Bob Barron, my father.
I was about to say, who? Your mom?
Yeah.
Your dad?
My dad is in that
Drive,
movie. He was an extra in the basketball scenes because they shot at the University of Oregon when my dad was at Oregon, and he's always told the story. My dad was like, "Yeah, I thought it would be really interesting to go down and like be an extra on a film." So he went in and he went in the film, and he said he saw Nicholson directing the film at that time, and he said Nicholson was just like, we didn't know who he was. He was just like this hippie guy. I remember he had like long hair, and I thought it was so funny. Like Nicholson first of all, Nicholson had hair, and then I was like, it was long, and then I was thinking, I wonder what he meant by long back then. You mean Daddy didn't have like a buzz cut, like
About 3 inches above the collar.
He had a little bit of hair, yeah. Anyway, but so my dad was actually an extra on that movie in the 60s.
That's cool. Back to what you were saying about Towne, I think that like this idea that he breathes on the page and like he leaves this like sort of thumbprint of realness to it, and that's like can really kind of catch you off guard when you're watching The Last Detail, because you're like, are these guys acting or is this like some sort of
is this written, right?
Yeah,
is it
exactly.
written? It doesn't feel written, and I imagine there is some.
There's some play, but
improvisation going on. So let's just tell the audience what this is about. So this film is about two shore patrolmen, badass Buddusky and Mulhall. Buddusky played by Jack Nicholson, and Mulhall, known as Mule, played by Otis Young, who are given an assignment, a task. They have to take a 19-year-old sailor who has stolen $40 from the admiral's wife's polio charity coffer. He stole $40, and he's been sentenced to 8 years. He's been given a dishonorable discharge, and he's been sentenced to 8 years in the naval brig. And Badass and Mule are these kind of Navy lifers. They're like in their definitely in their 30s, they've been in the Navy a while, and these two guys have to take him. They're given 6 days to take him to the brig.
Norfolk, Virginia to Maine.
Right. Thank you. So they have 6 days, and at first they say like, let's just take him up there as fast as we can. Because they're given like a per diem every day, so they're given money to live
for the
on.
Three of them. All three of them. Yeah.
Right. So the original plan between the two is like, okay, we're going to take this kid up there. in like 2 days, and then we'll party on our way back.
We'll use his per diem. We'll keep his per diem for ourselves and use the
Right.
money to have a get go on the way back.
In other words, they've kind of got this like system figured out. They know what they're gonna do, and they feel a little bit lucky. And the officer that assigns this task to them, he's a real piece of shit too. He's like a real smug piece of shit. He's kind of like, boy, you guys like won the lottery, man. You're gonna have so much of a good time. But the thing is, like, what happens in the film is that, first of all, from the beginning, they feel sorry for him. Almost before they even meet him, the first thing Buddusky says is like, well, who did he kill? The old man? Meaning, like, did this guy, he got 8 years in the brig? What did he do? Like, did he murder the admiral himself? Like, that's a crazy sentence. Like, these are not, like, super sentimental guys or anything. They're just like, okay. But, hey, we're going to, like, this is great. Like, we'll just get rid of this guy, and then we'll come back. But as they go on the mission with him and spend time with him, as they're escorting him up there, they start to like him, And so it's the plot of the film is that they decide essentially that they're going to kind of make sure he gets to do all the things he's going to miss over the next 8 years, because he's a 19-year-old kid, and when he gets back out again, he's going to miss so much of his life. So they want to go get him drunk. They want to go like party with him.
Get him laid.
Get him laid. Like kind of do all these like coming of age activities.
Get into a fight. Right.
But get in fights and, So yeah, I mean that's it. That's real. And then they just have to, the tension of the film essentially is like, they've got to drop him off at the end.
So yeah, that's what the movie's about. And I think that there's also this element of like, there's this not only like character development, but like character interaction that really kind of drives the film, and like how they interact with each other, how they interact with Meadows, who's the 19-year-old kid played by Randy Quaid. And so the film is really about the experience of all three of these characters. Yeah. So it's a shared experience by three totally different people. And through that process, you as the viewer are also having the experience. And, that's really what the movie's about. Now, I want to throw a hard fastball at you. And so you texted me when you picked this movie and we watched it. You said, Bob, this might be my favorite film ever. And I was like, wow. So I'm going to throw it out there right now and be like, why is this, or what do you want to talk about in terms of like how you feel about this film? And that might jump us off into talking about the film itself.
Yeah. So I did say that, and I would still hold to that. I would still say I think this might be my favorite film of all time. The question I have at the beginning of the film is like, why did they decide to do this for Meadows? So I wrote this down. I said, Badass and Mule attempt to expand Meadows' experience of the world, but in this like hyper condensed period of time to help him come of age. The film is about an attempt to live 8 years of life in 6 days, and it's an impossible task. But there's a kind of tragic nobility in the attempt, which is admirable. It's an act of care. Like they start to care about him. And what like Badass and Mule like don't bargain for is that they will also expand and deepen their own experience, and potentially like at a faster rate and range than either one of them was prepared for when they started the journey. This is like the central like kind of dynamic of the film. We're never like too concerned about like Badass Mule and Meadows getting caught for, like trying to get him drunk or like going to a whorehouse or like getting stoned. Like we're not ever really that worried. And we're not even really worried about like Meadows running away.
Right.
Because like, as we'll find out, like he has nowhere to go anyway. Like this guy just doesn't have anywhere to go. That's kind of the problem. The central tension of the film, the thing that's just sort of slowly building up in you throughout this whole film, sort of slowly rising in my chest as I'm watching, in my heart, is created by their rapidly expanding humanity's increasing inability to fit within the rigid, coldly inhuman system to which they all inextricably belong. In other words, the more human they become, the more they care, the more the kinder they are to him, is going to make it hurt him more. That's the question of the film. Like, is it better to be kind to Meadows, to give him these experiences that he's going to miss, let him taste it, then he has to go serve 8 years in the brig where he's going to get beat up by Marines and all this stuff for 8 years. And he's losing 8 years of his life. Well, now he knows like the value of what he's missing. It's almost, you could argue, like a form of torture, but it's done sort of with like the best of intentions.
Mule and Badass actually have that conflict. They have that disagreement throughout, like 2 or 3 times throughout the film, where like Badass is like obviously the archetype for or the motivating force for this week of like experiences, and Mule is trying to be a little bit more like conservative, and like he actually says at one point, like, we're not doing this kid a favor, and like that's their conflict. But to jump back to what you were saying about the kindness, I think that there's a sensitivity to the film, and which is, it's juxtaposed with not only like some of the most brash language that had been heard in a movie up to this point, and sort of just extreme situations that they find themselves in, but there's also like a simplicity to it. And I think to piggyback on what you were saying, like the most important acts of kindness that any of us could draw on from our own lives are often incredibly simple. That's the thing about kindness and sensitivity, is it creeps into these really like simple moments in our lives. It's usually not these grandiose things where like they're going to bust Meadows out and flying over, escape and get him up to Canada. And like, they're going to, like they're going to have, it's like, it's not this huge epic thing. It's actually really simple. It's really simple. And in that simplicity is a heartfelt, real sensitivity and kindness.
Yeah, they start to really like each other. Like you're watching. Why this is? I'm still answering this question, but I think at its core, my simplest answer is it's a film about how friendships form. You're watching these guys become friends, like become real friends, and they're becoming friends, kind of at this enormous cost, but they can't help it either. Like, they're spending all this time together and they're living together and they're sharing space together. There's this scene where they're in the hotel room together, getting just shit-faced drunk together and having a good time. Just 3 dudes hanging around in a hotel room, drinking beers, being stupid. And I think, we talk about being in my 20s. When I saw that, I can identify with that. That's what you do with your buddies. You go get drunk with your buddies in a room, and you get like, you get more and more inebriated, so you're saying stupid shit, and then you kind of sober up for a while, and then you have these really heartfelt, deep conversations with each other, and then it descends.
People start getting aggressive and then start trying to fight each other.
Yeah, like they're fighting each other, and then they're just like passed out. Like, I love the scene where he's passed out finally on the bed. Meadows is passed out on the bed, and then Mule and Badass have to like they have those like rollout mattresses or whatever, but they're just it's just all cheap hotels. Yeah, I'm ashamed to say it, like I've been there. I've been in those situations in a way, and but those are the spaces where friendships actually form. For me, what I identified with the film is it's about friendships, how our friendships make us human. And then the tragedy of the film is like, the system to which these guys belong to, like, doesn't have space for that. So what they're doing is always doomed, but they do it anyway. And I think it's really beautiful. One thing I really wanted to bring up as an entry point into the film, and I'm curious what you think about this. This is, without a doubt, the coldest film I've ever seen. I've never felt cold like I have felt in this film. They're just traveling by train in the Northeast in the winter, but there's just this biting cold. Like, whenever they're outside, they're just like, there's a scene, I think he's trying to light a cigarette for Meadows, and Nicholson, he's just like, hold still, like.
So I'll show you. I know that people can't see this, but I'm just going to hold this up. Can you see what that says?
Yeah.
Just says Bob's cold with exclamation points.
There's the exclamation points. There's an arrow. It's been circled by a box and all written in caps, everyone.
It's just cold.
It's freezing. So
it is, you said it. Like, I think anybody that watches this movie, they're going to be like, I don't like why they are cold. Like, this movie takes place in December. And I'm like, I think they filmed this in December, maybe even January. Like, this, it looks like it's absolutely freezing. And that just kind of speaks to like sort of that Hollywood new wave, like getting out of the studio system. We're on the street. We're filming in a real situation.
We're on location.
We're on location, right? but not to, not to get my elbow patches and pretentious pipe out, but like, I don't know how much that kind of informs sort of the attitude of Mule and Badass and Meadows, of like, there's like this sense of urgency to like get to a new spot and do, like, we can't just stand outside and fucking shoot the shit. Okay, like, we gotta like move. Like, are we eating here? Like, this place looks like it has a bunch of assholes in it. Like, let's go to the next spot. Okay, like, let's get inside. And I think that the coldness, anytime you have a film that has like extreme elements, it can really kind of like motivate the action of the film, and it does in this case. And what it does is there's like a kinetic energy to being cold. Like, when you're cold, you want to like get out of the cold. And but like anybody that watches this movie, I guarantee they're going to be like, oh shit, it's cold. Like, they're fucking cold.
Wear a sweater when you're watching this. You'll see what we mean.
Yeah, I think it informs the characters. Is that like, when you're cold, you're kind of pissed off, you're kind of agitated, like, get the fuck out of my way. And so, like, to take it to like, one of the most famous scenes of the movie is the "I am the shore patrol motherfucker" scene when the three of them go into the bar to try to get a beer, and there's like some underhanded race. So the scene is basically like Buddusky and Mule and Meadows stop into a bar to get a beer.
They take him off the train because he tries to run away off the train, just to set the context. Right. And then Mule and Badass are like, yo, this guy's crazy. Like, we need to like, he's kind of crazy. Like, which that's a really interesting scene where they catch him stealing again. He's stealing while they're taking him. They don't really care.
He's a kleptomaniac. Yeah.
He's a kleptomaniac. He has an issue. He has a real problem. So they're like, hey, we're going to get off in Washington. Let's take him off and walk him around a little bit. Like air out his head, basically. And then Badass is like, let's get him a beer. Or have you ever had a beer, Meadows? No, I never have. I'm not old enough. And he's like, everybody's old enough for a beer, And it's interesting because they've just caught him stealing, and then he ran down the train and he's bumping into people, and it created this whole, like, first of all, there's obviously like, he's running away, like, it's super stressful, but they're also kind of embarrassed because they're supposed to be doing their jobs, and as naval shore patrolmen, they should have him under control the whole time, and they lose control of him on the train. So it's a really interesting moment that when they lose control of him is really when they activate, like, okay, we're going to actually, now we need to like take him off, chill him out, and it's when we take him off the train to chill him out, to calm him down, to show him a good time. They're like,
right.
And part of it is that we think Badass wants a beer too,
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think it's like a failed, like that first attempt to like do just something to chill him out, let's just go have a beer. They fail. And that like kind of like motivates Badass to like, we're going with this. And so it's a really famous scene, and where, they go in, and the bartender, he throws a little like underhanded racism at him. He's like, basically alludes to the fact that like, well, I have to serve him, pointing
because Mule is African American. We should say that.
Right. Yeah. He's African American. And so the bartender kind of underhandedly says like, well, I have to serve him, i.e. like, I'm not allowed to.
Yeah. The law says I have to.
Yeah. And so, but he's like, I'm not serving Meadows because he's too young, because he looks like a 15-year-old teenager. And the scene starts to like escalate really quickly, and like that it gets into kind of, like Nicholson and the bartender have sort of this masculine sort of show off, where the bartender's going to reach under the bar and get a bully stick, and Nicholson, like, he's on it right away.
You can take your hand off that horse cock you got stashed under the bar there.
Yeah, but the famous line is that the bartender says, well, I'm going to call the shore patrol. And then Nicholson pulls out his gun and slams his gun on the bar, and is like, I am the shore patrol motherfucker. Okay. Like, and it's just, and the beauty is that where the scene ends, they don't get a beer.
Yeah. They don't get the beer. They have to get out of there.
Yeah. And then they have to go back out into the cold. And so, and then now they're back out in the elements, and now we're off. Like this thing of like, like, as you said, the cold weather plays an interesting theme.
It's really uncomfortable. And if, like, again, I'm from northern Idaho, which is a slightly different climate, but I know that wet, there's not really any snow on the ground, but it's like wet, biting cold. Like, there's a wind. There's just nowhere where you're comfortable. Like, you're just not comfortable, like, at all. So you're trying to, you want to get inside as quickly as possible. You're stamping your feet and rubbing your hands together. Like, and it's like the coldness just goes like right through you, which I think it speaks to, or it sort of paints like the coldness of this, like of the mission that they have, the coldness of kind of the system. Like this system, one of the things they, in their initial conversation, they say something like, Meadows tells them like, I didn't even get the $40. Actually, they caught me like trying to get the $40. I didn't even get the $40. Like I didn't even get it. And then Nicholson's like, wait, you mean to tell me they gave you 8 years in the brig and you didn't even get the $40? Like, man, they really stuck it in you, man. They really stuck it in and broke it off. And then Mule says to him, hey, man, be nice to him. Like, how does that help him, or something like that? And it brought up my point, like the system, this naval system that they're in, it's not about helping him, right? A system just protects itself. The system, all these actions are here to protect the system itself. Like, it's not about helping reform Meadows, what's happening here, in other words, right?
No.
Mule and Badass have sort of decided that they're going to, like, in a way, like, not reform him, but like, they want to actually help him. And so I noticed that there is this contrast of, like, in scenes, you know, when they go, for example, to the brothel, in the room with the woman, it feels warm in there, right? Mm-hmm. It feels warmer in the hotel room when they're having a good time drinking together. It's warmer when they go to the chanting session, and then they're hanging out with the chanter, you know, the yum yo renge yo, like I forget the name of that, but these human moments, we feel warmth. And so, like, there's a warmth, there's a personal warmth that they sort of stoke up between each other. They kind of warm each other up. Part of the film to me is about how they warm Meadows up.
Well, I think if you look at it in terms of like when they're outside, that's like it's analogous to this idea that like when they're outside, they're a part of the machine, they're a part of like the structure, and they're freezing and they're cold. And every time they take him to do something to like expand his experience and give him these life experiences, it's warm and comfortable, and they chill out and they're having a good time. And then when it's over, they have to go back out into the elements,
into the biting cold,
into the biting cold of this mechanism. But you brought up, I think, is a good transition point, is this idea of like one of the themes, or sort of like the thematic elements, that if you choose to kind of examine it this way, is the military sort of like as a representation of like the man, the machine, the operation. And then these guys that essentially have this really small window where essentially they're just trying to buck that machine, which, as we know from like the socio-political climate of the 1970s, which also comes up in this film from time to time, is like how the individual tries to break free of like this socio-political machine that they find themselves in. Now these guys, like, for several times in the film, they allude to the fact that like we're career sailors, we're career Navy men, like we're lifers. We're lifers. They're stuck in the system. And then this guy Meadows is basically like, he's going into the meat grinder. He's going into the worst version of the machine. And we'll get to the end of the film later, and like how the end of the film really, like, it's like a gut punch.
It's devastating.
But the whole point of them is to like have this moment. They're trying to like, they're struggling with this. It's the internal struggle of the characters. All three of them come at it from a different point of view, but they're stuck in this system. Yeah,
they're stuck with the system. But kind of to your point in the historical context of it too, you're right. Like, you know, this film was made in the early 70s. It's very much, all these people that are involved with this film are 60s Hollywood kind of, you know, it's got the spirit of the 60s. A lot of the reaction of the 60s was a reaction to the kind of like conformist, the post World War II conformist mindset.
The important thing to remember, I think, about The Last Detail is that this is not an overtly political film or a social commentary film. No, and so it's not like you're watching Z by Costas Gravas, or like, you know, The Parallax View by, you know, with Warren Beatty, and, you know, like, it's not like, it doesn't have overt political overtones. It's all just there. It just kind of permeates.
There are political undertones, but it's the sort of naked politics of it aren't what make it meaningful.
No. There's this little one-off moment when they're at the party and they're trying to get laid. They're like, meet these chicks. Yeah. They're the shaman chanting hippies, and like they go to this party and all three dudes, Mule, Meadows, and Badass, are all talking to a girl and they're trying to get laid. They're just trying to get laid.
Yeah.
And they're all taking like different approaches. and Mule is having a hell of a time because he's trying to talk to this girl, but there's this fucking wet blanket of a guy that's like keeps bringing it back to Nixon, because Mule's a sailor, and so like he's a part of the machine in this guy's eyes. And this guy's like, you mean you have no problem with Nixon? There's not one criticism you have in Nixon. And Mule's like, dude, I'm just trying to get laid here.
All this guy can talk about is like Nixon, you know, and he's so like serious and gung ho. And it's funny because like you see that he also just is, you know, belongs to an ideology. He has an ideology too that's speaking through him. And whereas like Mule in that scene he's not being ideological. He's at a party. He's talking to an attractive female, and like he's actually, the conversation he's having with her, they're actually kind of like really connecting, but it's through just a normal human behavior, which is like, you know, they're just at a party. He's having fun. He's having like fellowship. Yeah. Maybe he's attracted to this female. We never see her again after that. One thing I'd like to talk about, again, sorry to bring it back to the world of the film again, but I caught this the first time I watched it. I always thought it was kind of funny. Like, these guys are in the Navy, right? They're in the Navy.
They're sailors.
Yeah, they're sailors. We never once see a boat. We never once see a body of water. You know, like, how do they travel in the film, right? Well, they're traveling by bus. They're traveling by train. They're walking, you know. I don't think you ever see like the ocean, the coast, the shore. These are the shore patrol. There's no shore. Like, and the other thing is the way the Navy is portrayed in the film too. It's banal. Like, as the film opens, it's a young officer looking for Buddusky, looking for Badass, for Nicholson. And Buddusky, have you seen Buddusky? Have you seen Buddusky? And you see guys like they have long hair, you know, like they're not like, these aren't like crack troops, right? Like they're not. These aren't
Delta Force Marines, right?
It's in this like building that is very, you know, polished linoleum and, you know, fluorescent lighting. And when they find Mule, like he's like ironing his shirt, you know, in a probably the laundry room. He's doing his laundry. When you meet Nicholson, he's like, obviously he's passed out in a chair. And he wakes up and he swishles around some like whiskey and spits it out into a bucket. You know, he's got a stub of a cigar in his mouth. It's sort of the anti-propaganda vision of the Navy, right? Like, join the Navy, have adventure, you know, see the world. Like, well, what is the world that we're seeing in this movie? Like, it's train stations, bus stations, brothels, cheap hotel rooms, dive bars, you know, rundown diners. Like, it's not this like epic adventurous tale. The only time we see like combat or anything like in the film is in this like cheap hotel room where they're just getting drunk and they're watching some World War II movie on the screen, and they're just like,
well, then they also have the fight with the Marines in the bathroom.
Yeah, I guess you're right. There is a fight with Marines, like, but they're literally fighting their own like team, right? Like, it's not like they're fighting the Germans or like, no, they're in a train station bathroom, and they get it, and they like essentially purposely start a fight
because those guys are in a different branch of the military. Well, you know, another thing I think it's a good time to bring this up is that, you know, we talked a little bit about like the socio-political sort of like seedlings that are in this movie. This is not an overtly political or even like a film that has like a lot of social commentary. Everything's very subdued. But that being said, like to a keen viewer, that's someone that's going to go back and watch a movie that was made literally 50 years ago. Like, you have to wonder, like, this film essentially transcends all of those socio-political and cultural elements that were probably, when someone that was in their 30s or 40s in 1973 and they went to watch this movie, they're going to pick up on a lot of that stuff. And I remember when you picked this movie to watch, I was like, is it going to be weird to watch this movie? Because I know like Vietnam meant something very different to people in 1973. Yeah. Richard Nixon meant something very different to people in 1973. And I was like, I wonder what my experience is going to be like watching this movie essentially 50 years later. And I was really happy that what I learned was that the reason we're talking about this movie, the reason that this is one of your favorite films, and the reason that this movie is so authentic is because it transcends
Yes.
all of that stuff. And movies that are too overtly focused on that, dude, they die on the vine, because once society moves forward,
Yeah.
that film gets left behind. But this one transcends all that stuff because it's about all the things we've already discussed: character, kindness, loyalty.
Friendship.
There are interesting themes that can be dissected, but ultimately the authenticity is what makes this film survive 50 years later.
This film is really an examination of what it means to be human. The tragedy of the film is that Meadows' humanity is being kind of stolen from him.
I noticed this thing of like, we're talking about Hollywood New Wave in the 70s, and obviously all these people that are in this movie and the people that made this movies, they were watching movies from the 1940s and the 1950s. We're talking like Bogart, Spencer Tracy, Rock Hudson, John Wayne. Okay, this is like our post-World War II, like America, the greatest generation, like everything's fantastic. And in this movie, I think what you have is essentially these like really kind of like this collision of like flawed male characters.
Yeah.
Like Badass and Mule and Meadows, they're all very flawed. They're not John Wayne. Okay, they're not like the guy on the hill that, or like Spencer Tracy or Rock Hudson. They're not these guys. And like that scene in the bar when like, I am the Shore Patrol motherfucker, that's like a collision of like masculinity of like, but it's very flawed. Like, as you said, like Nicholson's pulling his gun out and like slamming it. And like the film, like throughout the whole film, I think is like an examination of flawed masculinity.
I think it speaks to, it's just realistic. It's not, again, we're not looking at this fantasy, of what a man is like. And actually the scene, in a way, it's really funny, and Nicholson's so fantastic in that scene with the Shore Patrol motherfucker, but it's also pathetic. To your point, like they don't get a beer out of that. Like, and they actually terrorize this guy. Like I mean, he's a prick, but he is.
Yeah.
And later on in the hotel room when they're getting drunk, Meadows asks Badass, like, he says to him, he says, I wasn't mad at that guy. Like, why did you get so angry with him? Like, he was just doing his job. And then of course, like Nicholson asks him, well, what makes you angry? Something's got to make you angry. Like, what about me, Meadows? What about us? Like, we're taking you away. We're taking you to prison. And he says, well, you're just doing your job too.
Do you think Nicholson is like fighting the Nicholson's character? Do you think Badass is basically like fighting the disillusionment of not only the system, but like what his preconceived notions of like what a man was? I mean, like Buddusky, like, I don't know, like he seems conflicted in the film. There's a lot of conflict in him. And like, that's kind of what motivates him.
I think he's conflicted about what he's doing, about the ethics of what he's doing. I don't think it's about masculinity, actually, just to be honest, as much. Like, I think it's more about like the punishment doesn't fit the crime. The injustice that's being done to Meadows is so much greater than the injustice that Meadows did by taking $40. Like when Nicholson first hears 8 years in the brig, he literally thinks that he's murdered somebody. This is really because he offended the admiral's wife. Yes, he stole money. That's wrong. Like, that's absolutely wrong. But the reason it's 8 years and the officer at the beginning says, they're going to be taking a personal look at this one, is because he did it to the admiral's wife, and she has to get her plaque at the end of the year. Like, I think what happens to Mule and to Badass is that they are confronted with the absurdity of to the organization with which they belong. Like, and they are the instruments of enforcement, right? They're the guys that have to go and enforce the laws. But what discomforts them is, and what happens to them is their humanity starts to blossom through this friendship with Meadows. I want to talk about a scene because I think it will illuminate some of this, which is kind of my favorite scene in the film, actually, which is where they take Meadows to see his mother.
It's pretty harsh.
And I think it's also important to mention, Meadows doesn't ask to see his mother. Like, they encourage him. Badass tells him, like, let's go see your mother before you go for 8 years, which on the surface sounds like a really great idea. And it's done with, like, out of kindness, out of like, you should see your mom before you go to prison for 8 years, man. And then you find out on the train ride in that Badass asks Meadows, like, he's like, where's your father? And he's like, oh, my father lives in like Seattle, Washington. And he's like, in Seattle. It's in Washington. And That's like, I know where Seattle is. Like, but what does he do? And then you find out, I think he works at a hardware store, and he's married, not to my mother. And I think I have a sister, but he doesn't even know if he has a sister, right? You start to really get to know Meadows here. Like, you find out, like, oh, he didn't have like a father growing up. You cut to him just freezing cold, like standing out in front of his mom's door, and the mother's not there. I think it's really funny at first. They're like, let's go see your mom. And I think in a typical Hollywood film, like, they would go sit and the mother would be sitting by the fire with a blanket over her lap. And,
she'd be so happy to see her son, and they would help, like, try to figure this out. Like,
and there'd be this big dramatic scene.
They'd cover for him and tell him he's going away for 8 years on an important mission and blah, 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 blah.
They get to the doorstep and she's not even there. And then they're waiting, which I think is just funny. It's really sad, but it's also really funny. Like, okay, we went all this effort to go here and she's not even home. And then they ask him, like, could she be at a friend's house? And he's like, yeah, maybe over at Mrs. Esposito's house down the street. Well, why don't you go ask Mrs. Esposito if she's over there? And then he goes off. And then, remember, Mule freaks out. He's like holy shit. Like, yeah, we just let him, like, run away. And Badass is like, hey, calm down. He's not going anywhere. He's not going to. Well, how do you know that? And they, like, run down they're like going down the street. And then sure enough, Meadows is just talking to Mrs. Esposito.
Yeah.
And then Badass says to Mule, guys like Meadow, they secretly, like, they want to go to the brig because only bad things are going to happen to them out in the world. So this is actually better that this happened now because it just got it out of the way. But I also think the same could be said of Mule and Badass, right? And you'll sort of learn that later on. Like, these guys don't fit out in the world either. They're not going to the brig, right? But what's the difference in a way between the brig and the Navy?
Their life, right? Yeah,
there's not a whole lot of, like, it's still pretty rigid. They don't even have their own autonomy to move. They have to be driven to the bus station. Then they're on buses and trains. Someone else is always driving them. Someone else is always telling them where to go and what to do. And they have all these rules that they have to follow that a lot of the people that they meet in the film do not have to follow. Like, one thing you learn is, like, yeah, Meadows isn't going to run away because he doesn't have anywhere to run away to. He has nowhere to go. Only bad things are going to happen to him in the world. But then what you also start to learn in the film from that point forward is the same could be said of Mule and the same could be said of Badass. But then they go back to the house. They bring him back to the house. And then Nicholson says, why don't we go inside? Like, let's just go inside and wait for her.
Warm up.
Yeah, and warm up. Exactly. And Meadows like, I don't know. I don't really want it. And it's so, you're like, why wouldn't you?
It's your house.
Like, if I go to my parents' house, like, I would have no problem, like, walking in and just sitting in their living room, getting myself something in the fridge and, like, watching some TV. But he doesn't really want to go into his mom's house. And then Nicholson just sort of, like, opens up the door, and what we see inside there is it's
trashed.
It's just it's dirty. It's like there's a bottle, an empty
booze
bottle, and, like, some blankets on a couch. And what we are now in the presence of her absence. And they do not go inside at all because it doesn't look comfortable or it looks gross, and then Meadows says, I don't really know what I would have said to her anyway.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that ultimately when you're watching a movie like this, it's up to like you and I or anyone that's interested to, like, how deep do you want to go into, like, the themes that you can explore? But you can't do this with every film. You can do it with a film like The Last Detail because they are presenting these really profound ideas in such subtle ways. There's this struggle that we've talked about already, which is, like, this idea of just disillusionment and loss of innocence that come with the three characters. That, like, these Mule and Badass are, as you eloquently pointed out, they're in the system. They know they're in the system, but given, like, the socio-political, cultural elements of the time, that's kind of fractured. Like the Vietnam War and the president who's a crook. Okay, so in that moment, it's kind of fractured. And certainly, if you're a career sailor, a lifer, and then you start seeing cracks in the veneer, that's going to cause you a certain amount of stress and anxiety. And then what happens? They're presented with like this just ultimate injustice of like this innocent, pure kid who
He's not innocent. Like, he steals things, right? But he's not innocent. He's just a kid. He should have a future, right? Like, he should, and his future's been taken from him.
The film is like this, it's about each one of them coming to terms with and struggling with that overall idea. On one hand, we have these two dudes that are these lifers that are kind of struggling with the cracks in the system and reality that they have. And then there's this other dude that is just like, he's actually scary enough, as Badass points out, better off in this fractured, fucked up, broken system.
He probably went into the Navy because he didn't have anywhere else to go. Like, it provided a structure for him, right? But then he doesn't even fit into that. Like, he can't. Well, I think the
important thing, there's one important element which comes up 2 or 3 times in the film, and I think it's really important moment in the film, which is when Nicholson is teaching him how to signal flag with your arms. Yeah. And it's basically like doing Morse code with your arms, like Alpha, Bravo, Echo. And Nicholson, the first time they do it's when they're drunk in a hotel, and Nicholson's like, nobody gets this the first time, you're gonna fuck it up. And Meadows like nails it, and Nicholson's kind of like, Jesus, Meadows, like, that was pretty good. And they do it 2 or 3 more times in the film, and that sort of, and I think that also frustrates Meadows, Badass, and Mule, because they're like, this is a good sailor. This kid is good. He should be in the Navy, like, yes. And he's being fucked over. Okay, and we are essentially walking him.
We're facilitating that. We are enforcing his fucking over. The problem is that not that this kid is a thief. It's that no one was taking care of this kid. So he's been given over to the Navy, but no one's really taking care of him in the Navy, right? Like, it's got structure. They're feeding him, but nobody cares about him as a person.
No one bothered to recognize this guy's an amazing signal corps, right?
Right. Like, what starts happening in the film, though, is that Mule and Badass start taking care of him. This is why this is my favorite movie of all time. They start taking care of Meadows. And what happens when they start taking care of Meadows? He starts learning how to signal. He's really good at signaling.
He starts standing up for himself.
He doesn't steal anything else for the rest of the film. Do you notice that? He never again steals anything. There's this great scene where they meet the chicks at the bar, and then they go back to the girl's place. And it's actually just a normal, like, that's how it works when you're in your 20s. You go to a bar, you meet some cool chicks, or you meet, and you go back and you guys like hang out together, and maybe people hook up, maybe they don't. It's totally normal. Like, but anyway, there's a scene, they're in the kitchen together. Meadows and the woman are in the kitchen together. And then Meadows confides what's happening, that he's going to the brig for 8 years, and she really likes him. And she's like, well, I know a guy in Toronto. I'll make a phone call, and like, you can run the border. And she gives him like maybe the chance to escape. And then he says, oh, no, I can't do that, man. Like,
my buddies are getting in trouble.
It'll put those guys in a lot of trouble. And then he says it. He says, and those are my friends.
Right.
They just start caring about him. And when they just a little bit of 5 days of care, this guy starts to really grow.
I think it's interesting to juxtapose what we're talking about with the end of the film. Like the last 2 scenes of the film are, we talked about one of them already, which is Badass and Mule basically deliver Meadows to the brig, and they're presented with this hard ass Marine West Point graduate officer, and he's going to try to basically stick it to him by, like, they're back in the machine. They're back in like, you're fucked because you didn't cross your T's and dot your I's. And so so actually the moment of conflict there is that Nicholson went way over the top and basically beat the shit out of Meadows. Probably, the theme of that is like, sort of taking out his frustration of what is happening to this kid, basically beating the shit out of him, whatever.
At first, it's a really funny scene. They're like, they've got a day left, and they're like, hey, do you want to go back to the brothel? He's like, I've done all these things once, and
if I do them again, it loses its magic. Right?
Yeah, like, when I've done something once, it means something. And they're like, what would you like to do? He's like, I guess I'd like to have a picnic. And it's so funny because it's like frigid cold, it's freezing. And so they take him to a park and they're trying to make these hot dogs. And then they realize like they don't have buns. And he's dipping the hot dog in the ketchup, I think, or the mustard. They're trying to dip it in it's just really pathetic. And then Meadows goes and like signals to them. He kind of wanders off, and they're like Mule and Meadows or Mule and Badass are talking, and then they see him. They're like, "What's he doing?" And then like he does the naval signals that Badass taught him, and he says, and they're like, "B, Y, E, B, bye. Oh shit!" And then he like runs, and it's pathetic. He's never gonna get away. Like he has nowhere to go. There's never, but he runs away, and then he tackles him and he beats the shit out of him, but. Right before he runs away, Nicholson starts to kind of, in a way, like just entertain the idea of letting Meadows escape. I can't remember the lines exactly, but you see Nicholson kind of like
trying to keep it going. He's trying to keep the thing going. Yeah.
But the moment that Meadows actually tries to escape, like they just snap into it and they go and like they capture him. When he tackles him, it's almost like he's going to kill him. Like he's pistol whipping him. I mean, you could really, really put him in the hospital. Like it's bad. It's really bad. And it doesn't make sense because he's been so kind to him. Badass is the one that is really driving this activity of trying to give him these life experiences. So why at the end is he like almost like murdering him? He's enacting sort of his rage, I think, at the whole situation.
Right. And so but they're presented with a conflict, which is they have to make a choice. They either have to admit that they went over the line, or they have to pin it back on Meadows and basically say he tried to escape. Now, if they do that, if they say, well, he tried to escape, that justifies the beating and they're off the hook. But now Meadows is going to be fucked in the brig because he's going to get even worse treatment. And so they won't do either one. And then the officer keeps pushing him, and that's where they basically say, we're not saying shit to you until we get to talk to your XO. And that squashes that. But the next moment of that scene is like, for me, that was the most jarring moment of the film. And it's like so harsh in the way it snaps you back to reality, is the way that Meadows literally gets dragged up the stairs into the brig.
I'm so glad you brought that up. I just want to point out that actually happens before the scene. But yeah, they're delivering him to the prison, and there's a hard-ass sergeant at the window, and they bring him up. Right. Meadows is bleeding.
Yeah, so they just they literally, two guys grab him by the arms and like almost lift him off his feet, and they're just like walking him briskly up these stairs behind a cast iron gate. They open it up and they like slam it closed, and you're like, shit,
that's it.
It's over. Okay, it's over for this guy.
And it's really like almost literally like he's been devoured.
Yes. Yeah.
He's just snatched away. There's not a moment given to say goodbye, to wish him good luck. There's nothing. What is so powerful about it is there's no sentimentality, and this is not a sentimental film. Like when I'm saying things like, hey, they care about him. Like it's about friendship. None of that is ever presented in a sentimental or like shallow way.
Presented in a real way. Like I said, it's all like small moments. It's just like really small throwaway moments that are real. Yeah. And so how do you think, or what do you think about the way that last part in the brig and then their conflict with the Marine officer, then it juxtaposes with the actual last scene of the movie, which is Badass and Mule essentially have like left Meadows there, and now they're walking out.
Yeah.
And they're like basically having a conversation. Like the first thing they do is they have a throwback conversation to like the Marine that they just had the interaction with. They're like, fuck that guy, he's a pussy. Yeah. Like I'll fucking kick his ass, just like, and then they basically have a conversation. It's like, what are you going to do? Cause they have like 3 days now. Like they have to get back. They have 3 days of leave. They have a per diem, and you're like, okay, so like, what are you going to do? And it's really interesting the way that the movie ends, because basically, Badass says to Mule, like, well, so what are you going to do? And Mule's like, well, I guess I'm going to go to Baltimore and see my mom. And he's like, what are you going to do? He's like, well, I'm going to go back to New York. And there's like, okay, so see you back in Norfolk. Like, yeah, okay, cool. And then it's really awkward. It's to a viewer, as you said, there's no grandiose payoff here. There's like, and then the last thing that is said in the movie is, man, I hope our orders come in.
Yeah.
Like, i.e., that when they get back to Norfolk, they would get an assignment like, hey, you're going to report to this battleship. You're going to go on the ocean for 7 months or whatever. Like, I hope our orders come in. And then that's it. And then they just walk off and the movie ends. So I want to get your interpretation of that, or your feelings about it.
That's it. Like they had this experience and now they're reabsorbed back into their system. You know, like they're going back into their normal world. They managed to not get Meadows in more trouble, and they figured out a way to get out of that, and but now they got to go back to that world. And I think what's fascinating is that they want to go back to that world, even after all this shit that they've been confronted with. But they also at that moment kind of decide to go their separate ways too. They'll meet back up again at base. They might see each other around, but they're going to go.
By the way, I think this would be a great time to mention, these are not best buddies.
No,
these aren't
they didn't even know each other's names at the beginning of the film.
And then they had this wholly unique, authentic experience. Now it's over, and it's just kind of as we're conditioned to watching movies, are they gonna hug it out and we'll come back next year and see Meadows, and no, there's no resolution. It's just okay, I gotta go. Okay, I gotta go too. See you later.
See you later, man.
Holy shit, right?
And you get a sense that their friendship was bonded over Meadows, and now that Meadows is gone, it's relational. Okay, he's gone. We don't mean anything to each other anymore within the system. The system has executed its task of dropping off this inmate. Done. See you.
I think that.
But I think, we see the pain though. I think those guys they got fucked up by that though. Yeah. But they don't have a space to absorb it anymore, and they know that they don't want to sit around and talk about it. The best thing to do is just go back to the world we know.
I think that one of my favorite things about this movie, and why I'm so glad I watched it and we talked about it, is it's the authenticity comes through the simplicity, not only of the story, but of the situations that these characters are allowed to develop and blossom. And it gives the viewer, like me or you, we can have totally different interpretations, but I don't have to go so deep to understand what was going on. There are things there that can be dissected, but ultimately about the machine and about these guys that are disillusioned, or about, them fighting the system, and it's all there. And however deep you want to go, you can, but otherwise, if this is just an absolutely authentic portrayal of what would happen.
I found a quote about why they decided to end the film like they did. And I forget who said this. I apologize. But they said, inevitably, while we were making the film, we considered changing the ending so that Nicholson would let the kid escape. But I thought that would really be letting the audience off the hook. The audience must be left with the problem, because 99 out of 100 people in the audience, maybe 100 out of 100, would have done what Nicholson did in the movie and taken the kid to prison rather than risk their own skin. So I thought it would be completely dishonest of us to send the audience out of the theater with a warm glow, thinking, gee, the world is full of nice people.
Right. That's the whole idea right there. Yeah.
I wanted to just leave it there was a scene, it's at the brothel, and after he had his encounter, both encounters with the young prostitute there, and Meadows does. He's talking about whether or not that experience, it meant a lot to him, but he doesn't know if it meant a lot to her, to the prostitute. And he says, yeah, the first time it's it was I was in a gas station and she was checking my oil, but then they paid for him to have a real experience. And he's I wonder if it meant anything to her. And then Badass says something to him that I thought was so powerful. He says, she's a human being, kid. She's got feelings like everyone else. And
that's great.
And then Meadows says, well, it was real to me, and that's what counts.
We got to end it right there. We got to end it right there, dude. That's it. You nailed it.
All right. Well, the film we've been discussing today is Hal Ashby's 1973, 72, 73, whatever, early 70s, The Last Detail, starring Jack Nicholson, Otis Young, and a young Randy Quaid. Check it out. Bob, have a beautiful week. Thank you very much.
Thank you too, man.